Welcome to Casual Friday. So I want to update you on some finished projects and some in-progress projects. Then I want to talk a little bit about travel knitting and what I take with me when I go on a trip. The holidays are coming up, so a lot of people will be traveling either by car or by plane. So I thought I'd share with you what I take with me when I go on a trip and how I approach it. And then I want to talk about gauge and sort of my journey through understanding gauge based on where I was in my knitting life. Because even today, just like with every other thing in knitting, I am still learning. And there have been a few projects lately that made me rethink what I thought I knew about gauge and how I decide what needle size I'm going to need for a given project. So let's get started. So this is the same sweater I wore last week, and I think I may have even worn it on Tuesday. I finally got buttons on it though, and the buttons I chose, which were those tooled shell buttons that were vintage. I was afraid they might be a little bit too small, but they ended up being really perfect. So I'm very happy now that my sweater is officially complete. So last month I started working on a baby blanket for my niece who is pregnant, and her baby's not due till February. So once I had completed the main body of the sweater, I put it to the side and thought, oh, well, I've got a few months to do the I-cord border all the way around. And then I got an invitation to her baby shower, which is the first week of December. So I thought, oh, I better get busy. So I finished the sweater, or not the sweater, the blanket. It's just a little stroller size blanket. And I did an I-cord border all of the way around it, which is my favorite way to finish off a garter stitch or textured blanket of the sort. Once I completed my sweater and the blanket, then I was ready to get back to work on my daughter's sweater that I'd kind of put to the side a month or so ago. So last time I had put it to the side, I had the body done and then the neck. And so yesterday I picked up for the first sleeve and did the short row cap shaping, and then I begun working the arm. So I'm hoping to get this done before we leave for our Thanksgiving travels, but it may not happen, which kind of brings me to my next topic, which is what I take with me when I travel. Somebody asked me this in my Ravelry group now that the holiday season is approaching. She mention what she brings with her in terms of notions or types of projects, but wondered what I did and if I had suggestions for that. So the first thing you need to know about me is that anytime I plan on packing for a trip, the very first thing I think about is what sort of knitting I'm going to take with me. When you take an airplane anywhere, you're always limited as to what you can bring with you. When I travel by car, I can bring a lot more things. I don't worry so much about how big any particular thing is, and I'll bring larger projects with me. But when I'm traveling by plane, I tend to either bring small projects to work on, or I bring the first ball or two of a larger project. So I don't typically bring a large project that is midway or toward the end, unless that project is something like a sweater that I will complete at wherever I'm traveling to, and then I'll be able to wear it. So then I sort of pack it that way as part of my wardrobe, and then I can't wear it until I finished it once I'm at my destination. So typically what I do for airplane knitting is I bring something very small, like a ball of sock yarn, and my notions bag, and then a set of and then the needles that I'm going to need in order to knit the sock. Now, if it's a yarn that's new to me and I'm not really sure what gauge I'm going to want to knit it at, I might take a few sets of circular needles with me, because I do tend to knit magic loop on airplanes. because losing double points is a nightmare on an airplane. But I can pack it all my notions in this little bag. This is not a bag that was designed for notions. It was, I think it was one of those gift with purchases or something that my mother-in-law got, and she gave it to the girls and they didn't want it. So I took it. This particular bag has some important qualities to it that some notions bags that are designed specifically for knitting haven't done for me. And that is that the zippered opening is wide enough for my stitch gauge. So I can stick it in here and take it out with no problem. Years ago, or just a few years ago, I had a sort of little quilted cloth notions bag with a zipper. I don't know if I won it as a door prize, or I'm not sure where, or if I bought it because I thought it was cute. And I never liked it because the zippered opening wasn't quite wide enough for this. In order for me to get my stitch gauge in, I always had to put it sideways and then kind of jam it in there. And I really disliked that. So that's something that I found was really important for me, was just making sure that it was wide enough that I could pull things in and out. So the kinds of things that I take with me is I have a bunch of different stitch gauges or needle gauges. And I really like this one because it has a ruler and it has the holes, and then it has this kind of thing for checking gauge. It doesn't have every single hole. If you use Addy needles or some of the Knit Picks needles or even Chiaogu, some of the European metric sizes that aren't true US sizes won't be on here. Like 2.5 millimeter and 3 millimeter won't be on here. But I do have other needle gauges, and sometimes I take more than one with me. So another thing I take is I have a little canister of stitch markers, and I really like the locking stitch markers because I really don't like markers on my needles. I tend to like to put them in the fabric and move the marker up to help me count rows, or to help me remember where I last crossed a cable or made a decrease or something. And so that's how I tend to use markers. So I like to keep a little container of those. I always bring with me a measuring tape of some sort, and I like the kind that stay wound up and ratchet out like that, and that have a push button to zip it back in. I really like these. And I bring a pair of scissors. Now, I used to always bring this type of scissors, a pair of scissors where it has a nice short blade and a blunt tip. These are my kids' like kindergarten scissors or something. And there's no problem in the United States bringing scissors like this. You can bring scissors with a blade up to 4 inches with no problem. What I typically end up doing, and it may not actually be allowed, but I tend to forget about it because it's always in my bag, is these little folding scissors like this that they pull out and then they poke. So these do have a sharp point, but they're very, very short blades. And like I said, I think technically they're not allowed. I just never remember to pull them out, and they've never pulled them out when I've gone through security. I tend to remember once I'm in my destination and go, oh, I want, oh well. So the other things that I keep in my bag, you can probably hear this rattling, are crochet hooks and double pointed needles. Now, I have a terrible time keeping track of a full set of double pointed needles, and that is typically because I have a lot of them in my notions bag or in a pencil cup on my desk. I have some on my bedside table in a little vase. So they get split up, but mostly these days I use double pointed needles as cable needles or as stitch holders, or as if I'm laddering down to fix mistakes. So I like to have double pointed needles, and I like thin ones because whatever I'm knitting, I want to make sure that the double points are no bigger than whatever it is I'm knitting. So if I need to fix a mistake by laddering down and then knitting back up, that they'll be small enough. I also have several crochet hooks. These seem to be big ones. I don't know why I have big crochet hooks in here because I don't typically knit with that thick of yarn. I do like to have a very fine crochet hook in my bag. I don't use crochet hooks very often to fix mistakes. And typically, if it's something just a row before, I can just use the needles I have in my hands to fix mistakes, or if it's a mistake several rows below, often it's over a span of stitches and I need to ladder down using double points and then knit back up. But with socks, because I'm working with such fine yarn on such fine needles and typically at a very firm gauge, the stitches are really tiny. So I find that very helpful if I've dropped a stitch. A lot of times I can't quite make things work with the needles I have in my hands if I've dropped a stitch. And in that case, then I'll use a crochet hook, and I'll use a very, very fine crochet hook for that. But I just keep all of that in my notions bag pretty much all the time. So it's really a matter of just making sure I haven't left anything on my desk before I leave. And one last thing is I carry my yarn needles in a container, in one of these chibi containers. And these chibi needles, usually they come with 2 or 3 needles in them, and different color tips will represent different size of needles, like really large ones versus much finer ones. I just keep all of them in the same container, and I also keep the little key for my interchangeable needles in case I'm bringing those with me. Then I'll have a key with me, which I keep in here as well. Now, as far as the type of projects I take, like I said, I almost always take a sock project with me. A lot of times I'll take a brand new ball of sock yarn. Even if I have a sock in progress, I'll pick something new and the needles that go with it, and I'll start the sock while we're sitting in the boarding area at the airport, and then I'll just keep working through that sock on the trip. And sometimes I can get a whole pair done, sometimes I can get one sock done, but in some ways it's sort of a souvenir reminder of that trip in sock form. And I always bring an extra ball of sock yarn with me. It's sort of my backup knitting in case I end up having way more time to knit than I'm planning. Then I'll have that extra ball of sock yarn with me as well, because I always have to have some backup knitting. The other thing that I do before I leave is I look up where the nearest yarn shop is to where I'm going to be staying. If it's a place I've never been before, I typically will make a plan to visit the yarn shop nearest to wherever I'm staying. Or if there are a couple of different yarn shops, I'll look up and see which one seems to be the best one or has hours that are going to coincide with when I have time on the trip. But I really do like to visit the local yarn shop whenever I can. Now, once I've been someplace a time or two, I just like to remind myself where the yarn shop is in case I need to go there because I've forgotten something, or if, God forbid, I do run out of knitting. But every once in a while, I actually do need something at a yarn shop. And sometimes, because when we're traveling, we're with our extended family, and it's near the holidays or near somebody's birthday, I'll be talking to them about an upcoming gift that they might like, and would they like me to knit them something? And then we'll go to the shop together and pick out the yarn and pattern together. So I've done that a few times on these family trips. So as I've mentioned before, there are advantages and disadvantages to any type of sweater construction, whether it's top down or bottom up, whether it's knit seamlessly or in pieces. And one of the nice things about knitting a sweater in pieces is if you are working on a sweater, if you're in the middle of a sweater project and you're going on a trip, then you can leave whatever you've knit on the sweater at home. Like if you've knit the front and the back, you don't have to take it with you, and you can just work on a sleeve. You can take a ball or two of yarn with you and you can work on a sleeve. Regardless of whether I do choose to bring a really big project with me to work on or not, I really do find it helpful to have a small, fairly mindless project with me when I go on a trip. When my kids were young, I think it was a spring break one year, we went to Disney World. And there were days when we were at one of the parks all day long, and I would have my little backpack with me and I'd have my sock project in there. And we would be standing in line to get on one of these rides, and I would just pull my sock out and I'd start knitting on it because there's a lot of waiting when you're at Disney World. So there's this one time when we were at Disney World when I was leaning against a railing, and I think I was waiting for some of the family to get their lunch and then come back to this meeting spot. And I was just sitting there knitting on my sock, and a woman came up to me, and she had this sort of look of desperation and envy and said, "That was such a smart thing to do. I wish I had brought my crocheting with me." Like, she just was like, ugh. Because, it just gives you such patience to have your knitting with you, especially if it's mindless and you're not really worried about making mistakes. You just have something to keep you doing. And these simple projects were really important at the end of the day when we were back at our hotel and just brain dead from being walking all day and being exhausted. I wouldn't have had the mental power to work on anything more difficult. On the days when we didn't go to the parks, when we were just at the pool or doing, much easier activities, then I would have my more complicated project like the sleeve of a sweater with some cable work on it or something that I could work on in the evenings. So when I was a brand new knitter, I understood when I read a pattern what gauge meant, what the stitches per inch meant. It meant that the fabric should have that many stitches over an inch or however many stitches over 4 inches. And I was really good about measuring my projects as I knit them, but I never did a gauge swatch. It seemed like a waste of time to me at the time. And my projects always turned out just fine with the right gauge, so I didn't really see the point of it. And I was a new enough knitter and slow enough that it just seemed like it was so time consuming and I just wanted to get my project started. And so I never did a gauge swatch. But times were different when I learned to knit, and they're quite a bit different than they are even like 10 or 15 years ago. Things had really begun to change in the knitting world that would make, I believe, it would make new knitters struggle more with learning about gauge than when I learned to knit. And the difference is that when I learned to knit, we didn't have internet, we didn't really have independent designers. The patterns that I bought came from the yarn shop. I would go to the yarn shop and they would have patterns available. I'd have something in mind. I wanted to knit myself a sweater. I wanted to knit something for my niece or nephew. I was always knitting sweaters. And they had pamphlets and booklets, and they had books too. Sometimes I bought books. I have a number of books up here that are from my early years of learning to knit. But most of the time I would buy some sort of leaflet pattern, and they were typically produced by the yarn company. So if the yarn shop was carrying a pamphlet from the yarn company, it was because they carried that yarn. And so it was in the yarn shop owner's interest and the yarn company's interest to have patterns for the yarns that they sold. And so I often, found a pattern and it called for a particular yarn, and the shop sold that yarn, and that would be the yarn that I bought. And it would specify what needles I needed to use. Those would be the needles that I would buy. I'd go home, I'd cast on for the project, and it would turn out just fine. I'd get exactly the gauge that was called for. Now that's because I am an on gauge knitter. Like I am lucky enough that standard needle size that the average knitter would use is the kind of knitter that I was. Not all knitters are that way. Some of them are loose and some of them are tight. But if they were like me, where they were buying the patterns and the yarn in the shop, sort of together like that, over time, they would notice that they were a tight knitter or a loose knitter and that they would need to get it by a different needle size than what was specified in the pattern. So some knitters figured that out and thought, oh, well, if it says a size 7 needle, I'm going to need to use a size 5. And they learned that about themselves. But a lot of knitters didn't learn that. They just saw that they never got gauge, and so then they stuck to blankets or scarves or shawls. Well, sometimes I would be at a yarn shop and they wouldn't have that exact yarn. Instead, but they would tell me, oh no, you can use any of these yarns in this part of the shop, would be perfect for this particular sweater. Sometimes it was the same yarn company. And in that case, again, I would get the right gauge. Row gauge wasn't always exactly the same in that case, and I didn't really think too much about it, and it didn't really matter for the most part because often you're knitting to a specific length and the number of rows you get in order to get that length isn't really critical. So as long as you get the stitch gauge, then that's fine. So this is how I knit for years and years and years. And then I was on a knitting hiatus for a few years. And when I came back, I started knitting. Lots of things changed, and I've talked about this before. First of all, I discovered email knitting groups, and so started communicating with knitters in email groups. I found blogs and I found online knitting magazines. There was this whole community of knitters that I started interacting with. I met knitters in real life as well. And I started the Master Hand Knitting program where that first level is all about gauge and yarn tension and getting even tension and then understanding how to measure gauge. So, I had never paid attention to what needle size I used to get any particular gauge. All I ever cared about before was what was the gauge in this pattern and what needle were they asking for, and I just didn't pay any attention. But when I started working on the Master Hand Knitting program and when I started interacting with knitters in these email groups often were something like a sock knitting group or something like that, where they would produce a pattern. The moderators would produce a brand new sock pattern every couple of months that everybody would work on. And they would tell you the gauge, but they wouldn't tell you exactly what yarn to use. They would tell you fingering weight yarn, for example, and they would tell you what gauge that you should be getting. And then they would suggest a needle size, but they were very clear that not everybody's going to need that needle size. And that's when I really started to understand and correlate a specific gauge to a specific needle for me. And I started to actually understand the needle sizes and notice and learn about different yarn weights. I always knit in a very sort of narrow range of yarn weights previously. So I was expanding the yarn weights I was knitting with, expanding the needle range I was knitting with, and I was expanding my source of patterns. And so I was learning a lot more about gauge because of that. And so I was learning how to do a gauge swatch and finding out how much I could learn from doing a gauge swatch. So there were a couple of things I noticed. And one was that, with a size 7 needle and worsted weight yarn, 5 stitches per inch is standard, and that's what I was getting. But I also noticed that I could go a little bit thicker. I could get an Aran weight, just a little bit thicker yarn than that, and still get 5 stitches per inch. It would just be a little bit denser fabric. Like if I was going to knit a hat or something, I might choose to do that. But I also noticed that I could go as thin as I wanted, and I could knit with fingering weight yarn on those size 7 needles, and I would still get 5 stitches per inch. The fabric would be completely different. It would be very drapey and loose and able to stretch out very easily, but I would always get 5 stitches per inch. So I started learning that. I sort of kind of figured out, size 7, I get 5 stitches per inch. Size 9, I get 4.5. Size 5, I get 5.5. I just kind of went all the way down. Now it got a little trickier at the very tiny needles because I was working socks with those needles and I was working to a firmer gauge than would normally be worked. When you use a heavier yarn on needles that are meant for a thinner yarn, you can cram them together for a while, and then it gets to the point where you just physically can't squish any more together. And so what I discovered at the very tiny range of needles is that I would have to check gauge a little bit more often if I was using a yarn that was a little thicker or thinner, that I couldn't always rely 100% on always getting 9 stitches per inch on a 2mm needle and always getting 8.5 stitches per inch on a 2.25. That was takes a little bit more checking for me. But the other thing I noticed when I started looking at different yarns and making substitutions myself is that I would look at the yarn labels and I would notice that yarns that had the same stitch gauge didn't always have the same row gauge. In fact, a lot of yarn labels don't even list row gauge on there. But I wondered about that because I knew, I'm an on-gauge knitter. And so what's going to happen if I knit this yarn that says, 24 rows over 4 inches versus another yarn of the same weight that is saying 26 rows over 4 inches? And what I discovered was whatever the yarn labels said in terms of what needle size to use to get the gauge listed on the yarn label, if I used that needle, I would get the gauge on the label. So if I was making a substitution of one yarn for another for a pattern, I only concerned myself with stitch gauge, and I didn't worry that my row gauge wasn't exactly the same because I could tell that some yarns were a little bit different for whatever reason. I didn't understand why. I assumed it had something to do with the way it was spun or plied, or maybe it was the fiber. I really didn't know, but I did observe that not all yarns that had the same stitch gauge had the same row gauge. Because I always got the gauge listed in the pattern when I used the yarn and needles called for, and I always got the gauge called for on a yarn label when I used the needles called for, sometimes there was a conflict between what the pattern was calling for and what the yarn label called for. The yarns not only can vary by row gauge, but some yarns can vary to get the same gauge. Some yarns will need a different needle than other yarns will. But I use this sort of knowledge of, when I first learned about the correlation between gauge and needle size, and that was sort of in my brain, and I really rely on that quite a bit. But the thing is that I use the same types of yarns over and over again. So I tend to use smooth 3 or 4 ply yarns in whatever yarn weight, but they're very similar yarns, and they're usually wool or wool blend. I don't use novelty yarns. I just don't stray too much from that type of yarn. And so the knowledge I have about what needle to use with gauge is relevant in that regard. But then more and more often I was seeing patterns that designers were releasing themselves online, and the needle size started to get really unpredictable. And this is why I think some knitters might have more trouble these days than maybe I had when I first learned to knit, because it was so much simpler when I learned to knit. Because the designer is going to list what size needle they used, and they may or may not indicate that they're a loose or tight knitter. If they give you a stockinette gauge and you can figure out what the yarn weight is, you can usually then say, oh, well, I usually use, a size 7 needle to get that gauge, so I'm going to swatch for the stitch pattern using the size 7 needle and not the size 5 that the designer is calling for in the pattern. One of the things that I find very frustrating is if I get a pattern from an independent designer and they only list pattern gauge, particularly if it's a type of stitch pattern that can really change gauge from whatever would be normally knit with that same size needle in stockinette. So I really, really look for a stockinette or garter stitch gauge in addition to any sort of stitch pattern gauge that might be in the pattern, because it gives me an indication of where to start with the needle size. When I first saw the pattern for this sweater in Knitty in September, I was looking for a sweater that was knit with worsted weight yarn because I wanted to use stash yarn. So I was looking at the materials that were and the gauge and everything that was being called for this pattern, and there were 3 pieces of information that seemed to conflict to me. One was that the gauge was 3.5 stitches per inch, and I know for me I need a size 10.5 needle or a 6.5 millimeter needle to get 3.5 stitches per inch. The needle that was called for was an 11, which is actually quite a bit larger than a 10.5. It goes from 6.5 millimeters up to 8 millimeters. That's kind of a big jump. And so at first I thought, oh, well, this is an example of a designer who needs a different needle size than what I would need in order to get gauge. So I looked for the next piece of information, which was what is the yarn? And I did not know what Barocco Catena was, but it did list the fiber content of the yarn. It was mostly merino wool, and it was 120 yards for 50 grams, which is 240 yards in 100 grams. And that is more yardage than I would normally see in 100 grams of worsted weight wool. So it was making me think it was a DK or sport weight yarn in terms of the yardage, and yet the gauge was for bulky weight, and then the needle was for something even a little bit larger than I would normally use for bulky weight. So I found those 3 pieces of information to be conflicting and confusing. I looked for more information. I went on to Ravelry, I looked up the yarn, I saw that it was a bulky weight yarn and that it had a chainette construction. And then I'm like, oh, okay, that explains the yardage, because chainette yarns manage to achieve a lot more yardage because of their construction. And then I noticed that Barocco was calling for a size 11 needle also. So this was a case where the yarn company was calling for a size 11 needle in order to get that gauge. And then I saw that the designer actually works for Barocco. So all of that together led me to believe that I probably would need a size 11 needle in order to get the gauge on the ball band, because that's typically what I need. So I had all of that information, and then I thought, okay, I'm going to just swatch on a size 11 needle. I just did a little swatch. I'm like, yep, I'm getting 3.5 stitches per inch. I'm a little surprised, but I am. And so I started knitting the sweater, and then I realized it was a color shifting yarn, and I put the sweater to the side and ordered different yarn. And in the meantime, I thought, well, I've used a couple of these balls of this yarn, and so I might as well use it to knit samples for this pattern I was revamping and wanting to re-release. And so this pattern uses larger needles than you would normally use for the yarn, and I use the needles that I would normally use for bulky weight yarn in order to get the correct gauge. And it came out way smaller than I thought it was going to come out to, and I couldn't figure out why. And then I was like puzzling about this, and then I got my new yarn for the sweater. I knit the sweater, and I was working on my pattern for the reversibly cabled scarf again. And I started thinking about, why did the chainette yarn have such a different effect when I used the needles that I thought were appropriate for bulky weight yarn. And that's when I thought, oh, wait a second, but I needed an 11 for that sweater and not a 10.5. So therefore, so I realized, there's something about this particular yarn that causes it to need a larger needle than what I would normally need. So here I did a swatch. These are 3 different yarns. The bottom one is, I think it's probably Plymouth Encore, so mostly acrylic but also wool blend. And then in the middle is Cascade 128, which is 128 yards. It's 2-ply yarn, 128 yards in 100 grams. And then at the top is the Barocco Catena, which has 120 yards and 50 grams. So it has a lot more yardage, but it was also tinier. It just didn't have the same gauge. And so I knew that had been true from knitting my sweater. And I was just thinking about, why is this? Why is this? And I had been working on my sweater at the new knitting group I go to, and I was passing the yarn around, and somebody who's a spinner was noticing, they're like, boy, that's a really stretchy yarn. So when I was thinking about the needle size on this, I thought, oh, I bet it's the stretchiness of the yarn that forces the need for a larger needle. Because if you keep your normal tension on the yarn when you're knitting with this Catena, it's going to stretch. And so you need a bigger needle to force it to stretch around a larger circumference, so that when it comes off the needles, it will shrink down. It's going to shrink down, and it will end up being the gauge that you would get with a plied yarn on a smaller needle. So I started understanding why this needle size might be different. And I looked at other chainette yarns online, and I saw that routinely, not every time, but most of the chainette yarns are calling for a needle larger than you would normally think you would need for something of that yarn weight. And one of the comments I saw on, I think it was on this Catena yarn, was a woman who thought that this Catena was actually an Aran weight yarn because she'd had to go up a needle size in order to get gauge. And that's really a misunderstanding of the relationship between stitch size and needle size. Because as I mentioned before, when I was figuring out the gauges I would get for different needles, always using a plied wool yarn, one of the things I noticed was I could keep getting a thinner and thinner yarn and I would still get the same gauge. So it isn't that the yarn is thinner that causes you to need a larger needle. That's not what happens. It's the fact that the yarn stretches that requires you to use a needle that will make the stitches bigger. I noticed there were comments when I used a blow yarn way back in January, and I was fascinated by that construction. And I was reading comments about the particular yarn I was using. There was also some misunderstanding about that yarn as well, and people saying this isn't really a bulky weight yarn, and I think they thought that because it was kind of maybe there was more space between stitches than they were used to, and they were used to something being a little tighter. But this is where you need to understand how the construction of a particular yarn can really affect what the fabric is going to be like when it's washed and blocked. Because some yarns will really bloom, and the blow yarn was an example of something that when you washed it, it just expanded and it filled up the space. And a lot of what it's filling up with is air, and that's what keeps it so warm. So when you have a yarn that's a different construction than a 3-ply or 2-ply, 3-ply, 4-ply, or even one of those multiply yarns, when it's a different construction, that may be why you need a different needle size, and it may also be why the fabric doesn't seem the same as what you might be used to, and that washing and blocking and really understanding the qualities of this particular yarn that you're using is going to be more important. For chenille yarns, they have a tendency to do what's called warming, and if they're knit too loosely, and the stitches will kind of come out and look weird, and so you have to knit chenille with at a firm gauge. So you're packing those stitches in as much as you can. So you probably have heard that, oh, you should always do a gauge swatch and all yarns are different, but there really are ways of predicting when you're using a certain type of yarn. You should be able to predict fairly reliably what needle you will need to get a particular gauge. It's when you use yarns that are sort of outside the normal or typical type of yarn that you really need to look carefully at the yarn that's called for and the needle size and what's being called for, and then make your substitution, understanding that if you're not using a yarn that has the same qualities, that you consider what the gauge is actually going to be and what yarns you would actually need to use and what needle size in order to make something that's going to come out the same size. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you like my videos, you can support me on Ko-fi.com. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.